I don't believe that's a problem that's isolated to Auckland or New Zealand, believe me. It's still exactly the same in Victoria.
And is there ever a shift to rules in terms of obligation? You have no choice but to...
No, again, it's getting to the top person. If the Premier believes that a particular ambition is an appropriate one, then it can be pushed forward. But you will find that different government agencies will hold jealously onto pieces of land that could ideally be released for other demonstration purposes to produce exemplars, which fortuitously, or fortunately, is what has happened with the project that we're doing as a demonstration medium density project. It's through a combination of government agencies speaking well to one another and coming up with a good solution. But it took us a long time to locate a piece of land. It didn't happen overnight. And you've just got to harangue and hassle and be in there all the time. There seems to be
a number of great demonstration projects, particularly, I mean, there's a number of phenomenal social housing projects. K2, I think, is an example in Melbourne, where again it seems to be a demonstration of producing good quality, intensive housing in the city for state tenants, basically.
It's an impressive public service in Victoria. There are some very good people occupying senior positions. They don't promote people on the basis purely of seniority. It's on the basis of ability. There are an awful lot of young women holding senior positions there. It's incredibly refreshing.
Yeah, well, one of them was here recently. Shelley Pan, who works with you, was here. She was very impressive, I thought. Yeah, terrific. Around the time you were appointed to the Melbourne position, there was comment about the difficulties John Denton, your predecessor, had being sort of both a player in the architectural practice and as a sort of umpire as well. If we were to have such a position in New Zealand, it's very likely we would run into the same problem. Do you have any sort of tips about that?
Well, my replacement in Western Australia is from a large firm, from a large practice, and you just have to develop a series of protocols that allow you to skip around it. Otherwise, you're doomed forever to have an academic in the role, or to bring people from out of town.
Yeah.
I seem to be following that path in both places. But I think John Denton did deal with that very well in Victoria, and it's widely acknowledged that he did very well. The practice chose not to bid for government work during the 2.5 years he was in that position, which is a tough request for practices that are reliant on public work.
If you believe what you read on the internet, you once said state architects are important to ensure controversial projects are not stymied by media populism. And I think Gary's firm has just run into that sort of problem just last week where, well, you talk about it, Gary, but basically a really good building, presumably, I haven't seen the drawings, but I know what I know what Gary and Nico
clearly
wasn't. Supported by council at council officer level, but declined at commissioner level.
Yeah, urban design panel support, a lot of support within council, a lot of confidence, and absolutely hammered by commissioners. No chance to even bother appealing, particularly.
On sort of populist grounds,
yeah, very much so. Yeah. And I mean, we were challenging the district plan because we felt intensification along major arterials is an appropriate way to build my future city and our future city. But we got, hammered. But I had a question that sort of perhaps wasn't so much about that kind of thing, but...
Can I respond to that first?
Yes, sorry.
There are some interesting examples in other parts of the world, Canada in particular, where elected members in local authorities establish policy, but they do not make decisions about its enactment. They appoint expert panels to do that, and they forego that capacity to make the decision. And I think in a place like Vancouver, it's demonstrable how successful that has been, very clearly demonstrable. But in terms of what you're talking about, the problematic project, we had over a project that my office was involved with in Western Australia, the rather unpleasant circumstance of the mayor of the city of Perth standing spruiking at one end of a city mall about the ghastly nature of what was being proposed on a site opposite his office, with the architect at the other end spruiking the reverse. Fortunately, the project was given development approval by the Planning Commission that had overall power over the site. But there's an awful lot of that kind of argumentation going on. That project sadly never saw the light of day through a series of other factors, but it's now coming forward in another form which will be equally as good.
I think it raises a good issue about the trusting of the expert panels and things, which sometimes I'm not really sure that is followed through on. And in my experience, certainly not. I just wondered your opinion about in New Zealand, if we were to set up a government architect kind of role, whether that part of the strength and the effectiveness in Australia is that it's regional, it's not the whole of Australia. And I'm just sort of wondering, we've got a super city coming, and it seems as though a lot of the urban design initiatives and architecture initiatives have been snipped out, which I'm gutted about. But it seems to me that New Zealand could work quite well with a sort of a top of the North Island region and a central region and a southern region, perhaps. Do you have any comments about that, or could it be managed from one office over the whole of the country?
It would be presumptuous of me to make comment about how things might work here in New Zealand, but certainly the fact that we have government architects in all states in Australia now, except for South Australia, and that's being worked on, has not precluded arguments being made for establishing a Commonwealth government architect, and that's being pursued quite aggressively on a number of fronts. I think just establishing one position, it probably doesn't matter where it is to begin with, just so there is a voice that is given some authority within government, a voice that can be heard, that is able to make rational arguments, that draws on good precedents, that doesn't talk solely about how something looks, but attempts to justify design decisions on a whole raft of well-considered factors would be invaluable.
I mean, so many of the key things that you were talking about how one chooses architects on particular projects, how they become funded. I mean, all of those no-nos that you talk about are things that still certainly up for grabs here, which certainly a single architect,
And the people effect would presumably...
Can I just say one last thing on that? Don't think the battle is won. It's a fugitive battle, and you're constantly having to argue for it. Politicians change. People in positions change on a regular basis. I think it's a constant argument that needs to be made.
I think there are plenty of people that suggest that New Zealand is only just big enough to be a state of Australia anyway. That might provide some answer to the question. Look, I don't want to interrupt, but the time has come to say thank you to Geoffrey for his delivery, his speech, his contribution, and to the questioning panel. Thank you very much. Then, just in conclusion, to thank you all for attending, to the speakers for their contribution. I think that perhaps out of this come many lessons. The purpose of these occasions are to gain and share knowledge. Perhaps two things that might stand out today in particular are those of advocacy and leadership, something we've been talking about in particular in respect of urban design, and I think that in particular we wanted to perhaps present the idea that in our community we could do well to emulate the Australian model and others, of course, of the role of a government architect. Thank you.
Interesting stuff. Very.